Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
The former New York Fed President Bill Dudley with this to say: the Fed should prepare markets for the unexpected. To an unusual extent, the world's most powerful central bank leaves the public in the dark. It can and should do better. Bill joins us now for more. Bill, let's take it to the top, from the top, and welcome to the program, sir. What is the importance of a central bank articulating, conveying its reaction function, and where do you think the SEP falls short at the moment?
The advantage of conveying your reaction function is the markets can anticipate in real time as the economic outlook changes what the Fed's going to do in the future. And that actually speeds up the transmission of monetary policy to the real economy. If the markets know how the Fed is going to adjust, market prices adjust immediately. And so that makes the Fed's response communicated to the market, to the economy more quickly. So that's a really good thing. Right now, the summary of economic projections is very much focused on the modal forecasts of the 19 FOMC participants. And so it doesn't really tell you much at all about what the Fed would do if the tariff impact turns out to be larger on inflation or turns out to be larger on growth. How will the Fed pivot? How much will they cut rates? This is why a lot of central banks around the world publish staff forecasts with scenarios or publish committee forecasts with scenarios, which basically the scenarios give you some sense of what the central bank will do if things turn out differently than expected. Last week, Bernanke gave a presentation at the Federal Reserve, the second annual Thomas Laubach Research Conference. He basically outlined why the Fed needs to do this. The Fed is basically an outlier. Every other central bank does this in one form or another that are peers of the Fed, and this would actually help the Fed both communicate and also pivot when things turn out to be different than they expected. If you had a scenario in, say, 2021-22 that inflation might stay higher for longer, that probably made it easier for the Fed to terminate its large-scale asset purchase program earlier.
Bill, isn't this something that effective communication in the news conference could address?
Well, I think the problem with the news conference is the questions are very much focused on the central forecast and the summary of economic projections and the dot plot. So we don't get into a lot of detailed analysis of what if. When Powell is asked questions about, well, what would you do if this happens, he usually says it's data dependent. We'll see. If you have actually sketched out alternative scenarios, that gives you a little bit more meat on the bone to sort of see how the Federal Reserve would react if things turned out differently than expected. The Federal Reserve already does this as part of the staff forecasts that are given to the Federal Open Market Committee participants. They do what are called alt-sims, which basically are simulations of if the world turns out to be different. So this is not like it's not being done internally already at the Fed. I think sharing a little bit more of this information with the public would be very helpful.
Well, Bill, there is one argument that part of the reason market participants concentrate so much on that median outlook is because it is anonymous, that what we get in the SEP, we don't know what each individual member thinks. So it forces us to coalesce around that median. Should there and could there be a scenario where we do know what each individual member thinks, that it is no longer an anonymous survey put out to the public?
Well, another shortcoming of the summary of economic projections is you can't connect the interest rate dot back to the forecast that person made for unemployment, inflation, and growth. So you can't really discern an individual person's reaction function. There have been proposals been made from time to time that let's actually publish what each person's forecast is, so you can actually sort of see that reaction function. I think that would be an improvement over what we have today. But of course, then people are going to be, trying to figure out, well, which dot is the chairman's dot. And I think, communicating broadly to financial markets, to people who are less, Fed watchers than me or you, I'm not sure that connecting the dots really allows you to provide that nuance about what will the Fed do if things turn out differently than expected.
It does seem like we're in an environment, though, where Chair Powell has been trying his hardest not to make news. And part of that, Bill, seems akin to what's happening in politics, that President Trump is more likely to say something about where the path are going and his displeasure for it. What changes if we do get something to what you're proposing, where you get more scenarios? Is there increased political pressure? Is that a risk that the Fed should think about?
Well, I think the political pressure of scenarios is that you're writing down things that might be not so good. So let's imagine that the Fed wrote down a scenario where the tariffs are going to turn out to be higher for longer. That's going to feed more into inflation. I'm sure President Trump wouldn't like that, but still, it's a possibility in terms of the economic outlook. And the Fed really does need to think about things beyond the central forecast.
Can we just wrap it up with something you've touched on a few times, Bill? If the dual mandate is in conflict at the end of the year, which side of the mandate do you think they should prioritize?
I think it's really difficult to say at this point because it depends on what the risks are of making a mistake. So let's imagine that you decided, oh, I'm really more worried about the growth side. And then as a consequence of that, inflation expectations became unanchored. Then you'd have a real mess in your hand. You'd be back in the 1970s, not a great place to be. So I think it's really not just about which factor is more off target, but also what are the risks of being wrong. And I think why the Fed is paused right now is because they don't want to be wrong. This is a very tricky situation where you don't know where the trade policy is going to land. You don't know the impact of trade policy on growth and inflation. And you don't know how this is going to affect households and businesses in terms of their attitude toward future inflation.
Bill, appreciate your input as always, sir. Bill Dudley there, the former New York Fed president, with a new column on Bloomberg Opinion.